Thanks, Gauhar. So thanks for that introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to spend the next sort of hour together on Zoom. It's kind of an interesting experiment for me. So today's talk is called Writing Your Way Through the Pandemic. And like Gauhar said, it's inspired by a podcast that I started making with the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking, which is a nonprofit higher ed here in Paris. And it's entirely run by volunteers. So I've been making an episode every day of the week, Monday through Friday. And the idea of the podcast is to sort of keep people company around the world as we kind of weather our way through this pandemic by doing writing exercises together. So I'll talk a little bit more about the podcast later, but just to give you a rundown of what I'm going to sort of go through today, I wanted to not just talk about writing in theory, but also in practice. So I'm going to start off by reading you something maybe 3 minutes long that I wrote myself, and then talk a little bit about writing, especially during this time, this very particular time that we're living in, and give you a list of 7 recommendations. And then we'll sort of segue into a writing exercise. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. Okay, so first off, starting off with the reading. I have an excerpt here from the novel that I've been working on over the past couple of years. And I wrote this particular part that I'm about to read on March 18th. So that was a day after the government here in France announced very restrictive lockdown measures. So I know that we have a lot of international people here. So just to give you a sense of what's happening in France right now, we're on week 6 of lockdown, and here in Paris, the lockdown is pretty restricted. So that means that all the sort of shops and businesses are closed except for the ones that are deemed to be essential. And whenever you go outside, you have to carry with you a piece of paper saying why you're going outside, and you're only allowed within a 1 kilometer radius of your home and for only an hour. Okay, so just to give you a little context. So a couple of things to know about this novel. Try to imagine that we're in the 18th century, okay? So 2 centuries ago. We're actually in 1765. We're in a very remote part of France called the Gévaudan. It's hilly, and pretty cold, very windy. And there's a beast, a mysterious creature that has been prowling around these hills. And there's news that it has killed a number of people, specifically women and children. And by the way, you can look this up later, but this beast really existed, or at least its victims definitely existed. And no one could really figure out at the time what it was. They had all kinds of theories, and you can even find old engravings of it, trying to sort of represent it as people thought it might be. So it's a really interesting mix of fact and fiction. The person speaking here is a 19-year-old housekeeper. She lives with her vicar, the person that she works for, and her younger sister, Thérèse. Okay. People kept saying it was only a matter of time before we managed to chase it away, that it would soon tire of our hills and move on of its own accord. Yet I couldn't help but feel the weight of dread in the pit of my stomach. What if it never left? What if it was here to stay and we had to live with it from here on out? It was the quiet that really got to me in those days. When I went from the church to the vicarage now, I felt it pressing against my ears. It was the stealthy silence of people cooped up indoors, waiting, wondering when it would next be safe to go out into the fields, thinking about the rows of cabbages that were now rotting, unpicked out under the wide, impassive sky. It was the airless quiet of women holding their breath, avoiding their men, grown irritable from being indoors. The children bickering between themselves, the supplies of flour and cheese melting away day by day. Even those houses that were well stocked, like ours, with a full larder and an attic hung with salted meat, even those were quiet, counting down the days we'd last before someone would have to venture out again and bring back more. The vicar, though he was among the first to lecture anyone who ventured outside, did not seem to think the beast might strike him as well. He paid daily visits to his flock without any concern for the curfew, and the constable came to eat, like in the old days, pleased that order at last was reigning in the streets. It was believed that if you went outside, you weren't just putting yourself in danger. You were also tempting fate, bringing on the calamity of the beast by defying it, luring it into the village by daring to walk around as though you didn't fear it. Thérèse wanted to discuss the best way to fend off the beast in case it attacked us. It's not going to attack us, I said, and felt something tighten in my throat. But just in case it does, she said, it's better to make a run for it, right? But then I heard you're not supposed to turn your back, which means we should probably back away from it without running, but that's hardly very, do we have to talk about this right now? I was thinking, if it's the two of us, then maybe one of us could turn around and run properly, while the other stands their ground. Maybe we should decide right now who it'll be. She wanted to know all this and more, and didn't seem to understand why discussions of this kind sent me scuttling into the orchard, away from her, humming to myself so I'd drown out her voice. It was impossible to think about anything else, but precisely because it was impossible, I couldn't bear to think about it, to talk about it, and though the beast weighed on my mind, I resented my sister's habit of discussing it at all hours. Fear had transformed us all into shriller versions of ourselves. I was beginning to see that the beast lived in all of us, and the more we talked about it that spring, the more powerful it seemed to become. Okay, so that was the last thing I wrote relating to the novel, and that was more than a month ago now, and I haven't been able to work on it since. Why? Because we're operating in a world that is completely in upheaval and in crisis. And during these times of distress and grief and fear, it's hard to feel like a fictional story set in the 1960s in rural France has any kind of relevance. And I've literally been afraid to open the Word document until today because I was afraid that I would look at it and it would just be this pile of meaningless words. And it turns out I'm not the only one. A lot of writers are struggling with this. So here are several conflicting impulses that I feel as a writer and that you may be familiar with as well. On the one hand, when the world seems to be falling apart and you feel powerless to some extent to stop it, you turn to well-worn coping mechanisms. And my own strategy for surviving in this world is to write. On the other hand, when the world seems to be falling apart and you feel powerless to stop it, writing may feel a little pointless, frivolous even, or even self-indulgent, right? You might have some feelings of shame and guilt around it. While other people are out there saving lives, why are you writing? So say you do decide to write. How can you write about anything that's not immediately related to the virus? If you just look at our media right now, there's hardly an article these days that gets published that isn't related to COVID-19. Say, so you choose to write about the crisis because it's the thing that's happening everywhere and it's impacting your life. Then you run into another kind of problem, which is you start to wonder how your experience of this crisis is any different from everyone else's. Since it's impacting nearly every single human on the planet, why should your piece of writing matter? Am I making you guys feel uncomfortable yet?
No, that's wonderful. In fact,
Okay.
you're
No,
just, you're
absolutely.
speaking what's actually going on in the world. And I'm
Okay.
completely agreeing with every word that you're saying, completely. Please go ahead.
Okay. So all of these are valid questions, and I don't have any answers for you. But all I can say is that the following. I live in an apartment here where my landlord has left all of his books. And I picked one up the other day, this one, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Nobel Lecture on Literature from 1970. It's very dusty. And he was writing in the midst of the Cold War at a time when tensions were very high. And it seemed like at any moment, at any day, the world might collapse into nuclear war. Here's what he had to say. Whole countries and continents repeat each other's mistakes after a while. It can happen even now, in an age when it would seem everything is clearly visible and obvious. Again, he's writing in the 1970s, so think how relevant that sentence is today. The one and only substitute for experience we have not ourselves had is art, is literature. We have been given a miraculous faculty to be able to communicate despite differences in languages, customs, and social structures, the life experience of one whole nation to another whole nation. Literature communicates irrefutable and condensed human experience from generation to generation. So I want us to think about that for a moment. Irrefutable and condensed human experience. So far, novels, short stories, poetry, and memoirs, these are the ways that we have to share one person's consciousness and worldview with another. The feeling that one person has about what it is to be human that they then give on to someone else. So until we've figured out a way to literally download our brains, which I'm sure some people are working on right now, this is the best we have. Okay, so here's a list of 7 recommendations that I think can help for those of you who may want to write during this time. And again, I'm not inventing anything new here. So I'm borrowing from writers whom I admire. And unlike Solzhenitsyn, these writers are still alive. And some of them even have books coming out, and they've had to cancel their book tours because of the crisis. So I'll cite them as I go along in case you want to look them up and check out their work and maybe support them. Okay. So recommendation number 1, don't beat yourself up over being productive. Sari Botten, the editor of Long Reads magazine, talks about this in her essay, Why I'm Giving Myself Permission to Keep Writing at This Time. Shakespeare apparently wrote King Lear while he was in quarantine, and Boccaccio wrote Decameron. And let me tell you, it's okay if you're neither Shakespeare nor Boccaccio, because while this may be a productive time for some, for many, it's in fact impossible to write right now. So if your gut reaction is to call your friends and family, to watch the news, to maybe organize a neighborhood support network, or take a crash course on epidemiology, then you should be doing that and not beating yourself up about being productive, because everyone has their own creative process. Okay, so that was don't beat yourself up over being productive. Advice number 2, redefine what writing means. So here's my fellow Iowa Writers Workshop graduate, C. Pam Zhang, writing for LitHub. It's a shame that when we say writing, we mean only the act of putting words on the page. How dull, how short-sighted. So she has a running joke where she calls all kinds of things writing. Bread making is writing, Netflix watching is writing, sleeping is writing, looking at flowers is writing. Her point is, if writing is a way of feeling the world as a human, then all things you do in order to feel human are actually a form of writing. I have a friend who was telling me a couple of days ago that she hasn't been able to write lately. And when I asked a couple of questions, I realized that what she meant was that she hadn't been able to work on her novel, the sort of project that she'd set out to do. But she had, in fact, been doing a lot of reading. And she'd been journaling, and she'd been playing on her guitar, and she'd even had a few new ideas for a pilot because she's a scriptwriter. She didn't consider any of this serious writing, but it's definitely part of the process. And in fact, the actual setting down of words on the page can't really happen without all of this other stuff that came before it. Reading, for instance, is a huge part of writing. I think most writers actually read a lot more than they write. So maybe now is a good time to snuggle up with a book, like C. Pam Zhang's book, which is just coming out right now. Okay, so we're coming up on tip number 3. Figure out your warm-up routine. So when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to work on anything in a kind of sustained way, and I realized that the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking wasn't going to be able to meet for its regular courses, I turned to writing prompts, sometimes called free writes. These are 5-minute bursts of writing that you do that aren't related to anything else that you're working on. It's just for the fun of it. It's kind of like the equivalent of improv for people in the theater, for actors. You literally have to start writing a sentence without any idea as to where it's going to end up. So I started my podcast, The Quarantine Quill, because I realized that these unassuming little exercises were helpful to me, and maybe they could be helpful to other people as well. So most of the free writes I do on a daily basis don't end up going anywhere outside of my notebook. They never become anything else, like a poem or a short story that I then try to get published. But it's still writing, and sometimes they'll give me ideas for something else. Recommendation number 4, write something share-proof. Now that expression comes from the writer Emily Gold, author of Perfect Tunes, coming out this spring. And what she means by that is that this is writing that's not meant to be put out into the world. It's kind of like secret writing, writing that you're not meant to share with anyone else. And maybe it's the free writes that I mentioned earlier, or it's something else, but it'll get you sort of tinkering with sentences in a way that feels low risk, and also hopefully help you find a very honest and straightforward voice when you think that no one else is listening. So tip number 5, let your curiosity lead you down rabbit holes. A lot of us think or assume that we have to have things figured out before we can set them down on the page. And to some extent, this is what we've been taught in school, right? You kind of have a very set structure of how you're gonna, set out your argument. But the poet Mark Doty, and here's this book, that's Mark Doty. The poet Mark Doty wrote something that I really love and that I have above my desk, which is, questions are always a little more trustworthy than answers. So give yourself permission to jot down random thoughts, impressions, quotes, ideas. Maybe keep a little notebook right next to the actual work you're supposed to be doing that you just keep open, and from time to time, whenever something comes, you jot it down. And follow these interests, even if you don't know where they're going. Writers sometimes can get really obsessed about product, about sort of a short story that they want or a novel that they want, especially in the United States. We're very product oriented. But it's really nice to sometimes just do things without having any idea about where it's going to go. And I think it's particularly important right now because my hunch is that in order to sort of handle uncertainty in the wider world, it's helpful to embrace it in your own work and to sort of make room for it in your own private world. So recommendation number 6, write by hand. So writing by hand forces you to keep going, to not overthink. The problem, there are lots of things that are absolutely fantastic about word processors, but one of the problems is that it taps into the urge that we all have to correct ourselves constantly. And also, you have real physical momentum when you're writing in a notebook, and you can literally feel it when you've hit on some good material because you want to keep writing even after your wrist hurts. And final recommendation, which is kind of ironic given the context, but take a break from screens. So it seems counterintuitive to want to isolate yourself even more at a time when we're already very isolated from each other. But there's something about being in front of a screen that sort of automatically makes us passive. So if you can, I would urge you to sort of intentionally chalk out 1 hour or an afternoon or even a day and make the decision alone or as your entire household to turn off all your devices and try to interact with the world in an analog way, because you're guaranteed to find new and creative ways of passing the time and finding new ideas to write about later. Okay, so those were my 7 recommendations. And now I thought we could go ahead and do a free write, a writing prompt together. So I'll give you kind of a moment to get settled in to, find a piece of paper and a pen. So the idea of a free write is I'm going to give you a prompt, and then you're just going to try and start writing and keep writing for a full 5 minutes without stopping to reread yourself or thinking too hard about what you want to say. Try to keep your pen moving as fast as possible, and don't cross anything out. If you get stuck on a sentence or a word, then you can just abandon that sentence or that word and jump to the next line and keep going. Okay, so today's prompt is: write about a time you didn't know what was going to happen next. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and I'll let you know when we're coming up to the last minute. Okay? I'm going to do this with you guys. So you have about 60 more seconds. Okay, so wrap up whatever you're writing. And I'm kind of going to just open it up and ask whether anyone would like to share what they wrote or talk about maybe the experience of writing it, if anyone's brave enough.
Can I do that? This is Chitra.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'll just read out what I scribbled. And as Anna said, I just, kept scribbling whatever came to my mind. So it goes like, it was the best of times and the worst of times, as Charles Dickens had said. And I quote, the air was hung heavy. The air hung heavy around like a pall, and uncertainty roamed in the streets. Life, well, life was wandering somewhere in between. Sitting in my balcony, I saw a little bird that came up to my railing, and in its eyes, I saw something of a question. It seemed to ask, whatever happened to human beings? Well, I could just sigh. The bird saw me disinterested and flew past. It perched on the top of the gulmohar tree right in front of my balcony. The gulmohar was a bright crimson red, and it looked beautiful against the dark skies. Yes, the skies too had seemed ominous with the various shades of gray, making the backdrop even more mysterious. That's all.
Oh,
Thank
it's
you.
beautiful. It's really
Thanks so much for
beautiful.
sharing.
Thank you.
I love how the bird comes in and asks this question.
I actually felt, one day I was actually sitting in my balcony and a little bird, and believe me, I hadn't seen that kind of bird around. So probably it is a good part, probably a pro of the lockdown, that different kinds of, animal, the flora and fauna are coming up. So that bird actually came up, and I actually Googled what kind of bird this is because I had never seen it around in my region.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Would anyone else like to volunteer?
Yes, I would like to.
What
As
is that?
always, I'm sitting on the top of the mountain, looking at the big road that takes to the city. Silence. The sun is about to set and its last rays reflect on the lake. It's so beautiful. Do I see this beauty only when I'm sad? I ask him.
Thank you.
That was really nice. Really nice.
Yeah, I liked it as well.
The line, do I only see this beauty when I'm sad, stood out to me.
Mm.
A third volunteer? Does anyone want to pitch in?
Jamila, maybe you would like. No?
Thank you. I think I'm too old, dependent on the participants. So I think I didn't have such circumstances that I didn't have any choice or any further activities that would help me. Sorry, but I really like what the other two participants wrote. Actually, it's really,
Well, I have, this is sort of the kind of exercise that I do on my podcast. So if you wrote in English and would like to sort of send me what you wrote, but don't necessarily want to read it out loud right now, then you're welcome to. You can send it to anna@parisinstitute.org. And you can even record an audio version of it. And I'd be happy to incorporate it into the podcast.
I just, wrote your email in the chat so that it will be visible for everybody.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, well, so at this stage, unless someone would like to jump in and share, I'm just going to open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions about writing, the writing life, or writing in particular during this time, then I'm happy to answer them as much as I can.
I have a question actually, Anna, since
Sure.
nobody, I mean, everybody struggles when they write, and especially those who are, like you mentioned, even the real writers with their experience, they also sometimes lose inspiration maybe. And then they need time to come again to this process. So how for the, for other people who never wrote anything, but like reading, and maybe one day we're hoping to start something, how to come to this process so that it wouldn't discourage you? Because most of the time when I hear interesting stories happening around, I really want to write it down. But when I start writing them down, in the middle of it, I think that this is nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. And who am I fooling? Like, this is not a writer. So I kind of stuck, and then it's just there in my, notebook. So, so how to keep developing it, or finding the courage, and I don't know how to call this.
I guess
Yeah.
that happens with all of us. I would also like to know that.
Well, I mean, I think it's, one thing I was reading recently, one of my favorite writers, Lydia Davis, was talking about this, is that it's always kind of hard to end things. So I think a lot of us start stories and then don't really end them. And I really like this writer because she actually does really short stories. So sometimes stories that are only a paragraph long. And she talks about why she does that. And I think in part it's because she, there's a lot of fun and energy in starting something, and ending it might not always be that sort of energetic. So I think it's also good to think, well, maybe, maybe you want to write something that's short, and that's okay. And as soon as you start thinking, oh, maybe someone reading this might be bored, that might mean that you're bored with it, and that you could just leave it and start writing about something else. Or, maybe just leave a little white space, and that's the end of that paragraph. I don't know. I'm experimenting with this and sort of thinking, okay, how can I write right now in a time when our attention is so kind of divided between a lot of different things? And maybe one of the answers is to write in a kind of fragmentary way.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah,
if it's okay.
Sure.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing
Anna,
your experience, and I'm very much enjoying it. So my question is that how do you take your data, for example, in your novel, which you read at the beginning of the presentation, it is based on 18th century. So do you take data in the archives or in the historical materials from the historical books, or do you read the writers or literature works of that period? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did do a lot of research for this book, and some of it was in archives. So especially looking at the original engravings of what they thought this beast might have looked like, and also looking at newspaper articles from that time that were reporting on the beast. And for me, the real sort of question became at some point was how much research is too much, because I'm not a historian. I need to sort of maintain some kind of space there for imagination. And as soon as you sort of, approach creative writing as a historian, you end up second guessing everything that you write, because you're wondering, well, hang on, like, would they have had a candle? And if they did have a candle, would they have had matchsticks? And, so you kind of have to also find this balance between, yes, you want to do research, but then also you want to leave yourself room to make things up and maybe get it wrong. And one of the things that I did for this novel is I actually asked a historian who wrote about this period to read a couple of chapters and let me know kind of if I was making any kind of egregious assumptions. And that was really fun, actually, because we both knew the material, but from different angles, if that makes sense. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So you still work or clarify or confirm with the historians specific years and datas, but of course, at the same time, having that, that's the literature, right? So having the space for the imagination. So yeah, thank you so much. And if I may, I have a second question, but I can ask later.
No, Gulzad, go ahead.
Okay. So I was wondering about the language. I haven't read any work by you, but do you write mostly in English or do you write in any other languages? And so how do you feel when you write in English? If you write in other languages, how do you feel writing in French or I don't know? What is your creative process? Because some writers write like certain pages or certain words per day, and how do you schedule yourself? So I will be curious to know about it. Thank you so much.
Okay. So let's see, the first question was about language. And so my English isn't actually my mother tongue. My parents speak Hungarian and I grew up speaking Hungarian at home. But I chose to write in English because for me, it was the language of books because my family moved to the US when I was actually born in the US. And so for me, English was sort of the language in which we got, TV and children's stories a lot. And so it has remained sort of my primary language for literature. But I do actually write a lot about people who aren't speaking in English, if that makes sense. So I have a lot of, like this novel, everything is technically in French, but I'm writing in English. So sometimes I run up against some interesting problems about how to convey this world that is very much a French world, but all in English. And for your second question about creative process, well, I think it's different for every writer. And that's kind of what I was talking about in my recommendations, is that some people really work well with sort of goalposts, like saying, writing 1,000 words a day or whatever the number is. And I found for me that sometimes it's been very useful, and then there are other periods of time when it's actually been more detrimental because it's a tool that you use to then feel guilty. So what I do is usually what I have is a system where I write in the mornings. And I give myself sort of two methods of thinking about it. Either I write for 2 hours or I write until I reach 1,000 words. And that way, it's kind of a foolproof system where I don't need to feel bad about not reaching the 1,000 words if I've also sat there for 2 hours. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of a way to sort of have a routine, but not be too sort of oriented on the word count.
Thanks so much.
Anna, I have a question, please.
Sure.
The language these days, the language used in the verbiage, basically, that's used in the novels and the stories these days, to cater to a large audience. I mean, I tend to use I like to use a lot of floral language, but not very difficult. But yeah, new words, yes. So is it advisable that to use such language, such verbiage in your writing, or should you restrict yourself to writing, very simple language so that it can cater to a large audience? So how should it be? What do you suggest?
That's a really interesting question because it's, I was thinking about this the other day because for people who like to write, we tend to collect words. We tend to quite like discovering new words.
Yeah,
but then
exactly.
we have this problem, which is that how do we, sometimes we find a new word that if you put into the writing, people might not know. And then you're kind of stuck wondering, well, what am I going to do with these great words? And I mean, one way to think about it is to think, okay, how can I, is this word really necessary? What do I lose if I don't use this word? And the other way to think about it is also to think, okay, if this word is necessary to me, but some people might not know it, how can I place it so that I'm actually teaching people what it means, even if
Yes.
without them having to stop reading my text and get up and look at a dictionary or look it up online? Because that's what you want to avoid, right? You don't want people to put down whatever story of yours they're reading. You want them to keep going. So it's kind of this tricky business of figuring out, can I put it in this sentence? And one useful exercise is to actually do it with a made up word. So something, you make up a word entirely and you see whether if you put it into this paragraph, people might still be able to understand what you've decided it means, just through contextual information. And that's when you know, okay, that passes the test. I can keep it in there.
Okay, because that's how I have learned new words, by reading novels, by reading this thing. And I actually put down novels and went to the dictionary, and I actually used to jot down the word meanings. So that's how I learned. So yeah, I'll keep that in mind. I think that's a very good thing that you told me to do. Thank you so much.
Sure.
There is a question in this chat. So someone wrote, how can I better structure my writing?
Well, that's a very vast question. Does the person mean like structuring the actual text or structuring your time?
Doesn't say here. It doesn't say who wrote it, because it just says user. So I don't even know who that person is. The actual text.
The actual text. Okay.
Actual text.
Okay. Well, I think it really depends, but I think the kinds of writing that we're used to doing in like academic contexts and for work and for school also, those are the kinds of writing that they have a very low margin for uncertainty. Like, you want to be structured in them. The kind of writing that I do, often what's most difficult is actually giving up on the idea of structuring it as you're writing it, so that you let it sort of grow organically. And this is actually really hard to do, because most of the time we're taught to try and structure before you start writing a project. So my advice or my thought on that would be to completely scrap the idea of structure until you have a complete draft. And once you do, then you can sort of take a step back and start thinking a little bit more like an editor and less like a writer, and then trying to structure it. I don't know if that answers the question.
And what about structure of thoughts?
Of thoughts?
For example, I have like too many ideas in my head, and I think that I just can't handle this, and I'm escaping from writing because of this. But I really won't.
Huh, that's an interesting idea. Oh, hang on, sorry, there's something beeping in my part of the, just a second.
That's a telephone, I think.
I think, one writer that I would recommend.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, yes, it's okay. The internet was a little bit slow.
Okay. Oops. One writer that I would recommend is actually Jenny Offel. She has a novel called The Department of Speculation. And the reason I recommend it is because when you read it, you see that her mind is kind of working in this sort of like firework way, where she has like 15 different thoughts at the same time. And she's found a way to sort of, I guess, structure the novel so that you can see that and that it becomes fun rather than disorienting or scattered. I mean, it is disorienting and it's scattered, but in a way that keeps you reading. So I don't know if that, is helpful at all, Camila, about thoughts. But there are ways to make sort of the novel adapt to your own ways of thinking, if that makes sense.
Also, like you said that, like we talked about earlier, that you should keep writing down all the thoughts in a separate notebook, and maybe, all the relevant stuff can be used as you keep writing, the relevant references can be taken from those style of thoughts that have been jotted down. by you. So anything that comes to our mind, I think it's best to jot it down,
Yes, I
because
think you're
sooner or
right,
later we could
Chitra.
use them somewhere, you know.
My mom says that I should keep all the time my little notebook with me. So whenever I have any idea or fun stuff, I should just quickly write it down there,
I'm
wherever
gonna
I
do
am.
that from tomorrow. Sure.
There is another question actually from a girl, Diana. She says, English is my secondary language, but I'd like to mostly write on it. What would you recommend to make the most appropriate word selection?
Well, I think there's no magic sort of solution, but the thing I would recommend is to read a lot. I think we often underestimate just how like useful reading can be to writers, because we think, oh, well, we're not being productive, we should be writing our words. But as I was kind of saying earlier, that you want sort of to have read at least, I don't know, 100 words for every word that you write, if that makes sense. It's kind of a ratio. I'm kind of, ballparking that. But I think, and as sort of Chitra was saying, like that's the best way to learn new words also. It's actually not through the dictionary necessarily, but actually encountering them in different contexts. So you start to get a very fine sense of what they can mean in different kind of situations. So that's what I would recommend, reading a lot.
There is another question from girl Aida. She says, thank you a lot for the Zoom meeting. Anna, could you please tell me more about your favorite books or writers?
Sure. Well, so one of the people that I really love to read, as I was talking about her earlier, is called Lydia Davis. And she's the writer who writes very short stories. And one of the reasons why I like to read her stories is that when I read her work, I start getting this feeling like anything could be a story. Like even something so small, like walking into a room and seeing a fly, she's able to make that into a story. And that's really a wonderful feeling to have as a writer, that you feel sort of less weighed down by this need to really structure a novel to find a plot. You can actually make small little stories out of anything. So I recommend her writing a lot. Another writer I love is called Ali Smith. She's a British writer. And the thing I really like about her is that often one of the things that we worry about as writers is something called exposition. It's sort of, giving the reader enough information in the beginning so that they can figure out what kind of world we're in or who the characters are. And we spend a lot of time thinking about this and trying to figure out how to add in information. And she does this really well. Like she actually doesn't do it at all. It feels like she's not doing it at all. She just sort of lets you jump straight into the story, and you're it's a little bit sink or swim. Like you kind of have to swim hard to get through her stories. But I really like that about her writing. Yeah.
Thank you. There is another question from Aliyah. Are there any literature platforms that are willing to publish unknown authors?
Yeah. So there are a number of magazines and independent publishing sort of houses that are looking for emerging writers, and they're kind of scattered all over, in English, the United States and Australia and the UK. But one place to look that's a really helpful website is Poets and Writers. It's a magazine that's published in the United States, and they have sort of a database of a lot of different sort of outlets. And it's really extensive, so you have to sort of comb through it. But they have a lot of good resources. And another place to look is a place called Entropy Magazine. They sort of do a round out every couple of months. If you want to submit your work, you can look at who's reading work, who's asking for new work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have a question actually. Anna, can you tell us about your book, Wayword? And I don't know if I understand correctly, it's a poem book, isn't it? So if you could talk about a little bit about that. And
Sure. Yeah. So that's a chapbook of poems. So that's like a slim book of poems that was published a couple of years ago. And it came out of this project, which was, as you mentioned earlier, Gahar, when you introduced me, I'm trained as a journalist. And at the time, I had just graduated from journalism school. And I was working for a news agency here called Agence France Presse. And they're sort of like the national news agency. They do a lot of hot news, and part of my job involved being in front of a computer all day and being in touch with like Washington and Hong Kong, and sort of feeling very, very connected to the news. And after a couple of months of working that job, I really felt like my understanding of distance and time was really warped by the news cycle. And so I decided to go for a summer and walk from the border of France and Spain to this very old pilgrimage site called Santiago de Compostela, which is in Spain. And this is traditionally a Catholic pilgrimage, but I'm not Catholic. And today it's sort of used by a lot of different kind of people who in many ways want to rediscover what it's like to walk. And to not take a train or take a bus or take a plane. And so I walked for a month, and the poems came out of that. So there's a poem for every day of walking during that time.
Nice. Is it in English? Yeah.
Yes, it's in English. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we don't have any other questions.
I have
Guys,
one, please, if we have
sure.
the time.
Yes, we do.
And I just wanted to ask, say, for example, I wanted to write a novel and I want to make it against a backdrop of a place that I have never been before in person. So is it possible for me to, or anybody to write a novel with a backdrop of a place where we haven't physically been to? Would it make sense?
I think absolutely, yes. I mean, there are a lot of writers who are writing about worlds that don't even exist, right? So they're inventing an entire galaxy sometimes. So I can't imagine, especially if it is a place that exists in our world, you have,
for example, another city maybe, or another country. Yeah. So.
You'd have all kinds of information that you could base yourself off of. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question, if possible. Anna, nice to meet you, because I've just heard that you're trained as a journalist and you work for IFP, and I also worked here for IFP, like for Central Asia for a few years. Yeah, so nice to meet you. And I'm trained in that section, like also like journalism and the hot news, but I would actually love to do something of more like writing, and maybe like writing something longer, like a small novel. And so I have a question, like when I write something like a novel of like based on my personal experiences and stuff, like how do I know that it's not, how can I look from the reader's perspective, like how can I measure from the side, kind of try to see my text with the eyes of other person, that it's like not too boring for them, not too long, that they like actually understand and feel and sense what I want to say, and like how to measure it from the side if it's something longer, and like let's say something like a novel.
Well, I think one thing I would suggest is to do that once you have a complete draft, because the thing is you definitely want that mindset, but once you have completed something, because the thing is, if you start thinking, okay, how is a reader going to react to this while you're writing, the danger is that it'll take you out of the project and it'll make you stall on the writing process itself. So when you're writing, you really just want to be yourself and the page. But once you have a complete manuscript, and then you want to kind of see, okay, is this working? One of the things that's really helpful and very basic is to print it out and to make it look like it's not your own manuscript. So either change the font or something, and then to try and read it as though you were encountering it really like a book, and to try and be your own editor in that sense. Another thing to do that I've always done is to give it to a trusted friend, and to ask them, ideally someone who likes to read, and ask them sort of, where they think it's sort of working or not. And that's something that's really valuable, to have someone in your life that you can do that with. and sort of exchange and sort of bounce things off of them a little bit as well.
Okay, yeah, but so the first thing would be like, if I just decide to write it as like, let's say as a diary of my previous experience, that's fine to start with. And then you suggest like I structure it and maybe add some things. Yeah, but in the beginning, just like put everything down on the paper without like thinking too much.
Yeah, yeah. And also
Okay.
to sort of, and what sort of Gauhar was saying, like that moment where you start thinking, maybe, is this going to be boring? That's usually a sign that you're bored, like that you are boring yourself. So that means that, you know, you want to just like maybe put a full stop and then jump to something else or change directions or something. Because usually you're smarter than you give yourself credit for when you're writing often.
Okay, thanks. That's very precious. Thank you.
Guys, do you have any other questions?
Hello, I have a question. Can I ask?
Sure. Yes,
so
go ahead.
I'm not a writer at all, but my admission process in most universities require writing essays. And every time I write, it sounds just so dull, even though original story is kind of interesting. So even though essay writing is kind of a specific piece of writing, especially for university, maybe you could give some general advice how to make writing more interesting and brighter, maybe.
So what you're saying is that when you're writing for these application essays, you kind of find that you're boring yourself, from what I understand.
Yes, it sounds like, okay, I did this and then this and then this, and that's the result. And it just doesn't sound like reading. And
yeah. I mean, I think what's you know, useful to look at is that college application essays are kind of like their own genre. So they have their own rules, and they're really like, they're designed for you to be able to sort of prove in some way to someone sitting far away that you're like the right fit for that college, right? So, you know, once you've identified the rules of like what makes a successful college application essay, then you can start to play by those rules, and it will feel less like you're pouring out, you know, like your inner soul and having to put it into this very specific format. When you start to see that, okay, this is very much a format, the same way like, you know, a letter of recommendation has its own rules. And I think it might be helpful to look at examples of like successful college essays to see, okay, how do I hack this form? How do I make it so that I'm putting like my best foot forward in this very specific way that they're asking me to do? I don't know if that's helpful.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much.
If there's enough time, I would like to ask another 2 questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes. So my first question is that, do you have any recommendations of any contemporary writers whose language is not English, but they're writing in English? I will be grateful if you have any contemporary writers.
That's a really interesting question. So who are writing primarily in English, but well, I mean, one person I can think of, he's Afghani. His name is Jamil Kachai. And so he's writing in English, and he lives in the United States, but his English is not his mother tongue. And when he writes, he's actually mixing different languages. And he has in his book, it's called 99 Nights in Logar. He actually has an entire chapter in Pashtun, which is really surprising because the rest of the book is in English. And so he's sort of someone who is kind of, in some ways, mixing languages in a way that makes his book still understandable to English readers, but kind of throws in a bunch of different kinds of languages. So he's someone I would definitely recommend checking out.
Oh, okay, thank you. And so my second question is that you said that you were born in America and then now you're living in Europe. So I'm originally from Kyrgyzstan, and I'm writing all my writings in Kyrgyz. So in the future, of course, I would like to translate or start writing in English. My question is that, and myself, I have been living between Germany and North America for the last 5-6 years. I was wondering about, as a writer, as a journalist, or as an observer, what are the differences of readers or publishing your work between North America and Europe? Thank you.
Well, I think it's, I can't really sort of speak for like a sociological perspective. All I can say is sort of my own experience.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Which is that I think there's sort of an industry, a publishing industry in the United States that makes it that the gatekeepers, so the people who decide what becomes sort of lauded and who gets all the prizes, it's a much more sort of process with a lot at stake, because there's a lot more money involved. So that's kind of my perspective, is that you have a lot of different small publishing presses operating as well in the United States as in Europe, but there's sort of less of a one industry that has a lot of weight, the same way, as you imagine, like Hollywood has a lot of weight in the film industry in the United States. It's the same where like New York has a lot of weight. Whereas I think in Europe, some of that weight might be more sort of evenly distributed. Yeah.
Thank you.
There is a last question, I guess we're going to take, and then our time is already almost up, actually up already. So it says, question from Aya, what do you think about journaling? Is it really helps to improve your writing?
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of journaling. I think, it depends on, what you kind of do with it, right? It's sort of a very open-ended form. And here I would definitely recommend Lydia Davis's essay. She has this essay called 30 Recommendations for Good Writing Habits. And she talks about the kinds of notes she takes in her journal. And I think it's a really helpful tool for someone who wants to write more, because you can do sort of the kind of writing that you pretend isn't serious writing, and then still sort of get increasingly good at crafting sentences while you're doing it. So I would recommend doing it, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to terminate our session for today. It's been really great having you, Anna. And for those who've been a little bit shy of reading your text, you're welcome to email Anna, and I put it in this chat, Anna's email. Also, Evrim, I believe he shared a link to Anna's podcast, Quarantine Quill. And again, guys, you should really follow and do all these podcasts. It's been really great and enjoyable. So I think we're gonna thank you all, everybody, for participating, and Anna specifically, thank you for finding
Thanks for having me.
Time and sharing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. It was really enriching.
Thanks for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys, for
Gohar,
participating. Okay, then bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks much.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.